The night of April 4th, 1979. The sky over the state of Michigan is cloudless, but below is chaos. The passenger Boeing 727 suddenly goes into a steep bank. At first, it was quiet, almost imperceptible. A slight vibration, a barely perceptible tremor, as if the plane had touched an invisible wall of air. Seconds later, the vibration turns into a sharp jolt, and the giant machine begins to spin. There was darkness in the cabin, screams, and bodies hitting the ceiling. The fall feels like the free fall of an elevator that has fallen from the 10th floor. Only here it's 10,000 meters down. Commander Harvey Gibson tries to hold the wheel, but it resists. The instrument readings jump as if in a frenzied dance. The altimeter drops, the roll indicator rotates in a circle. The cabin is filled with warning signals. Everything merges into one continuous howl. Co-pilot Jess Kennedy shouts something, but the words are drowned out by the roar of the wind. Flight engineer Banks checks the hydraulics, no deviations. Everything is fine, but the plane crashes. At an altitude of 10,000 meters, the Boeing 727 turns into an unguided projectile. His wing is torn by an oncoming airstream at a speed of almost 1,000 kilometers per hour. All the pilots see is the continuous rotation of the earth and sky. A series of lights, horizon, then clouds, horizon again, lights again. The congestion is increasing every second. All that keeps the plane in the air is the strength of the metal and the will of the three people in the cockpit. Gibson pulls the steering wheel towards himself, pedals to the floor, flaps, zero reaction. The autopilot is disabled. The speed readings go over the critical level. And suddenly a short pause. A few moments like the silence before the explosion. Passengers in the cabin can see how the ceiling panels are cracking from vibration. Someone prays, someone just looks into the void, realizing that it is impossible to resist. Outside, in total darkness, the Boeing 727 is falling at a speed of about 600 meters per second. He is spinning in a spiral, as if he is losing his orientation in space. This condition is called an unbalanced downward spiral, a rare and extremely dangerous phenomenon when aerodynamic forces cease to obey control. There was no time to think in the cabin, just instinct and experience. Gibson decides to take a chance and releases the chassis. It's a forbidden maneuver at this speed, but there's no other way out. The hum of hydraulics makes its way through the roar of the wind, and suddenly, a miracle. The plane slows down and stabilizes. The rudder obediently returns to neutral. The fall stops. There was dead silence for a few seconds. Only the breathing of the crew. From a height where the air is already thick and heavy, they can see the twinkling lights of Detroit below them. They managed to get the car back under control. But what was it? Why did chaos suddenly start over the calm sky? Aviation does not know the concept of by itself. Every event has a reason. Were they crew mistakes, a technical glitch, or something that didn't fit into the instructions? That night, 89 people were caught between life and fall, between calculation and chance. And none of them had any idea that they would become part of one of the most controversial and mysterious stories in modern aviation. New York, the evening of April 4th, 1979. In the parking lot of John F. Kennedy International Airport, silver aircraft fuselages line up, one after the other, like giant fish ready to go into the ocean of the night sky. Over the noise of engines and tractor signals, a voice is heard on the speakerphone. Trans World Airlines, Flight 841. Boarding is coming to an end. The passengers slowly climb up the ramp. Someone is holding a paper cup of coffee. Someone is holding the latest issue of the New York Times. None of them are in a hurry. For them, this flight is just another route across the country, from New York to Minneapolis. No special date, no tension. Just an ordinary evening in the late 70s. At the front of the cockpit stands the crew commander, Harvey Gibson, 40, 4 years old, calm, collected, with a typical bearing for senior pilots and a slightly tired look. His colleagues call him Hood, short for his last name. He has more than 15,000 flight hours, 2,500 of which were on a Boeing 727. For aviation of that time, this is an almost impeccable track record. Next to him is the co-pilot Jess Kennedy, who is 40, a little younger but with the same expression of confidence. 9,000 hours in the air is not just an experience. It's the habit of seeing the sky as part of your job. And the third person in the cockpit is flight engineer Gary Banks. 37 years old, attentive, precise to the smallest detail. He is responsible for the following systems: pressure, fuel, electronics, hydraulics. Everything that makes Boeing a living organism passes through its hands. They are a typical Trans-World Airlines crew of the late 70s. Strict shirts, short talks, no fuss. Everything is according to the procedure. Before the flight, the traditional pre-flight check. Kennedy runs through the checklist. Banks confirms. Hydraulics, normal. Electrical, nominal. Engines, ready? Gibson nods. Everything is fine. Outside, the technician removes the plugs from the air intakes. The nose cone of the aircraft with the TWA logo glitters in the spotlight. The Boeing 727 is not new, but it is proven. This aircraft was launched in 1965 and has flown for more than 35,000 hours. He is considered a reliable workhorse of the company. The 3 Pratt & Whitney engines in the tail section produce a power output of almost 15,000 kilograms of thrust each. This machine is able to forgive mistakes and withstand any routes. It's a normal life in the cabin. A young flight attendant lays out pillows. Another closes the luggage racks. One of the passengers, a man in a gray suit, adjusts his tie and jokes with a fellow passenger. The main thing is to be fed on time. The neighbor at the window pulls out a paperback novel. The guy across the aisle adjusts the Canon AE-1 camera. Everything is according to the scenario of a typical evening flight of the 70s. No internet, no noise, just the smell of coffee and the slight hum of air conditioners. The dispatcher gives permission to start the engines. 3 jet turbines come to life with a low hum, turning into a steady, confident roar. In the cabin, the instruments show stable values. Gibson picks up the microphone. Trans-World 841 ready for taxi. And now the Boeing slowly leaves the parking lot, taxiing onto the illuminated runway. Before takeoff, the last check. The rudders are level, the rudder is neutral, and the flaps are in the takeoff position. At 20:54 local time, the crew receives permission to take off. Gibson gently gives traction. The engines are going into takeoff mode, the fuselage is shaking, the speed is increasing. 80 knots, 100, 120. Rotate. The nose of the plane lifts off the ground. The concrete of the strip disappears under the wheels, and behind the portholes is a dark ocean of New York lights. The landing gear is retracted, the autopilot is on. The plane is smoothly gaining an altitude of 35,000 feet, a little more than 10 kilometers. The fasten seatbelt sign goes off in the cabin. Passengers relax. Someone opens a mini bottle of wine. Someone takes out cigarettes. This is 1979, when smoking on board was still the order of the day. The frequency is the usual radio silence. Short negotiations between pilots and the dispatcher, dry and formal. Everything is calm in the sky. Gibson adjusts his headphones, takes a sip from the thermos and looks at the flat horizon. It was supposed to be another boring evening flight across the country, but neither he nor his crew nor 82 passengers knew that in an hour this flight would go down in history as one of the most mysterious episodes of civil aviation of the 20th century. 35,000 feet is a flat, clean altitude, where the air is already thin and the sky is turning almost black. The Boeing 727 flies confidently and steadily. In the cabin there is a steady hum of engines, soft instrument lights, and the measured clicking of switches. Everything is going according to plan. The autopilot is on. The course is stable. Speed, 530 knots. Normal cruising mode. Gibson looks at the instruments. Banks makes a note in the log. Fuel consumption, system pressure, temperature. Nearby, Kennedy checks the weather forecast. Clear skies ahead. No thunderstorms. No turbulence. Perfect flight. There is a different reality in the salon. Passengers are having dinner with the clatter of spoons, and light jazz music is playing from the onboard system. Someone orders more coffee. Someone is already dozing with his jacket tucked under his head. The lights are dimmed, and the flight attendants are pushing a cart with drinks, smiling as if everything is under control. And somewhere behind the cabin wall there are 3 people who are sure that the night will pass peacefully. 40 minutes have passed since takeoff. TWA Flight 841 is over Saginaw, Michigan. Gibson bends slightly to the dashboard to check the course. And at that moment he feels a strange vibration. Not a sharp one, but rather a slight tremor, as if someone had put their hand on a thin metal string. What was that? What is it? He asks, looking at Kennedy. I don't know. Maybe a stream? The co-pilot replies, but the shaking is getting worse. A short buzzing sound can be heard in the headphones, as if the motor is hitting a metal sheet somewhere behind. Gibson glances at the instruments. Everything is stable. No warnings. And then suddenly the plane tilts sharply to the right. Not smoothly, like in a gust of wind, but abruptly, aggressively. The roll angle is increasing. 15 degrees, 30 degrees, 45 degrees. Faster and faster. Gibson instinctively grabs the steering wheel, pulls to the left, but the plane is not responding. Turn off autopilot, he shouts. A click. The autopilot sound disappears, but the roll continues to grow. 60 degrees, 70 degrees, almost 90 degrees. The Boeing is tilted with its wing down, as if falling sideways into the void. Warnings light up on the panel. Alarm sounds are superimposed on one another, an altitude signal, a roll signal, an overload signal. Everything merges into a cacophony. Kennedy presses the rudder pedal, tries to return the horizon, but the steering wheel seems to be jammed. Gibson completely deflects the steering wheel to the left, but there is no effect. The plane doesn't seem to hear its pilots. Flaps up, air brakes. Gibson's voice is harsh, braking. Kennedy reaches for the air brake lever, but nothing happens. The airflow is so strong that the control surfaces do not obey. 1 second, 2 seconds, and the plane crashes. The feeling of weightlessness. Everything inside, from the tablet to the mugs, flies up. The Boeing 727 is entering a downward spiral. This is not just a fall. It is an uncontrolled rotation, when every second loses hundreds of meters of height. Banks checks the systems. Everything is fine. No hydraulic failures, no pressure loss. The aircraft is technically sound, but he's falling. What's going on? Kennedy's scream cuts through the siren. Gibson clenches his teeth. Everything he's learned in 20 years stops working. They're losing altitude. 33,000, 30,000, 25,000 feet. The speed is increasing. The needle of the device goes beyond the red zone. For 100 knots, for 50, there is a rotating world outside the portholes. The black sky, the flash of city lights, the sky again. A second later, everything changes places. The people in the cabin are pressed against the ceiling. Screams, crashing, the smell of hot metal. Gear down, Gibson suddenly commands. Kennedy doesn't understand. Are you crazy? At this speed. Gear down now. He pulls the lever. The hum of hydraulics cuts through the roar of the air. The landing gear is starting to come out. And suddenly, as if an invisible hand grabs the plane by the tail, the fall slows down. 4,600 meters. The Boeing is still rolling, but more docile. Gibson feels the rudder coming to life. Finally, control returns. He carefully brings the plane to the horizon, catches the balance. At an altitude of about 1,500 meters, the aircraft stabilizes. A second later, everything goes quiet. The silence doesn't seem real. Only the whistling of the wind in the cracks of the hull and the hoarse breathing of the crew. Gibson takes the microphone. Mayday, mayday. This is TWA 841. Emergency descent. Requesting immediate landing in Detroit. Seconds drag on forever. The dispatcher replies. Roger, TWA 841. Cleared to descend and proceed to Detroit Metro. Below is the black expanse of Michigan at night. The plane is damaged, but it's holding up. There is an overload of fatigue and silence in the cabin. It's over. Almost. They saved 89 people, but they themselves did not yet know that now another struggle would begin. For the truth. The Boeing 727, having lost control, is spinning at an alarming rate. The altimeter jumps like it's gone crazy. 33,000 feet, 30, 27, 25. The vertical descent rate is almost 600 meters per second. This means that for every second the plane loses a whole block of altitude. Beyond the portholes, the sky and earth blended into one solid spot. Everything in the cabin is shaking. The devices rattle, the panels vibrate, and small parts fly out of the niches. The red alarm lights are burning like garlands. The automatic signals merge into one continuous roar. Stall, overspeed, bank angle. Warnings sound simultaneously, drowning out human voices. Gibson presses the steering wheel to the left, with no effect. Kennedy works the rudder pedals, trying to catch even the slightest response. But the plane seems to freeze in a stubborn rotation, not obeying the laws of aerodynamics. Banks checks the hydraulics. The pressure is normal, the fuel pumps are working, and the electrical system is intact. Everything is fine. Everything except the plane itself, which suddenly stopped listening. The crew is silent for a few seconds of absolute concentration. Everyone knows that panic kills faster than overload. Gibson abruptly pulls back the autopilot, manually pulls the steering wheel. The cables are stretched to the limit, and his arm muscles ache as if he's holding a falling car with his bare hands. Flaps. Negative response. Kennedy replies, the flaps don't move. The air is so dense that the aerodynamic surfaces are blocked by the oncoming flow. Outside, behind the cockpit, the wings tremble as if alive. The right one is slightly tilted down, the asymmetry creates a torque. The fuselage creaks, the skin bends. The roar of the wind makes its way through the hull, and every bend of the metal reminds us that the ultimate strength is close. 1 second, 2 seconds, and the plane makes a complete turn around its axis. Rotation. The sky again. Earth again. The black night and the white lights of the cities underfoot. The people in the cabin are screaming. Everything that is not secured flies up. Luggage, trays, chairs. One of the passengers sees through the porthole how the wing seems to be dancing. It bends under load, and it seems that it is about to break. Air brakes. Gibson screams. Kennedy pulls the lever to no avail. The air brakes are not coming out. Then the commander does something that is not prescribed in any manual. Gear down. Landing gear down. Kennedy turns around. Are you serious? It's going to blow everything off at this speed. Let me out, damn it. Now. He pulls the lever. A click of the hydraulic system, and a moment later, a hum. The metal flaps of the chassis begin to part, releasing the struts. The air current hits them like a wall. The landing gear almost breaks off, but the air resistance creates a braking effect. At this point, Gibson feels the rudder pedals finally come to life. The steering wheel, which seconds ago was made of stone, begins to move. He carefully presses down on the left pedal, the steering wheel to the left and on himself. The plane responds. The roll is decreasing. 70 degree, 50 degree, 30 degrees. The air becomes manageable again. 4,600 meters. They're still falling, but they're not spinning anymore. The passengers are silent. Someone clasps their hands in prayer. Someone just closes their eyes. The smell of hot metal and kerosene is in the air. People feel that the skin of the aircraft is deformed. The small crackling of metal comes right from under their feet. Flaps 15, Gibson commands. The flaps are slowly coming out. It's a risk at this speed, but landing is impossible without them. The height is 1,500 feet. The stripe is already visible. The plane goes just above the glide path. It needs to be adjusted. Gibson doesn't let go of the steering wheel. His gaze is fixed on the strip. He knows that one wrong move and the Boeing could fall apart right at the touch. Speed 160 knots, Kennedy reports. Check. Touch. A moment later, tires roared. At first, the front rack hits too sharply, but it holds up. Then the rear wheels. The hum, the screech of brakes. The air brakes are still coming out, albeit partially. The plane is running along the runway, losing speed. And suddenly, silence. Braking is over. The Boeing 727 stops on a concrete strip in clouds of smoke and steam. No one moves for a few seconds. The one that will unfold not in the sky, but on the ground, in offices, reports, and courts. The investigation began on the morning of April 5th. The hangar where the damaged Boeing 727 was parked smelled of metal, kerosene, and burnt insulation. The huge machine that had been through hell now looked almost calm, like a predator that had finally been cornered and immobilized. But there were signs of a struggle on the body of the plane. And every dent, every crack could tell the story of a flight that almost ended in tragedy. NTSB investigators arrived from Washington on an early flight. Among them are experts in aerodynamics, control systems, and those who can read black boxes. There was no emotion in their task, only facts, figures, and the sequence of events. The first thing that caught their eye was the right wing console. There was a gaping void where slat number 7 should have been. The mechanisms are deformed. Part of the hydraulic cylinder is torn from its fastenings. Investigators recorded the damage and sent to search for the wreckage. The Saginaw, Michigan area is where the plane began to fall. Search teams moved there. A few days later, pieces of metal were found in a field, among corn remains and tree fragments. One of them is a fragment of a slat with a partially preserved node number. The analysis confirmed that this is exactly the part that broke off from the right wing of flight TWA 841. A series of experiments began in the Boeing laboratory. The engineers examined the parts, checked the serial numbers and the hydraulic cylinder of the drive. The conclusion turned out to be alarming. The slat could only move out if the command was given to release it. That is, mechanically, it is impossible without human intervention. To understand how dangerous this is, you need to know how the system works. The wing of a Boeing 727 consists of two main parts, the leading edge and the trailing edge. Slats are located on the front, movable sections that extend forward and down, increasing lift at low speeds. There are flaps on the trailing edge. They work in tandem with the slats, creating additional thrust for takeoff and landing. Everything is hydraulically controlled, but it has a common drive. If the slat comes out at cruising speed, this causes a sharp asymmetry. One wing loses stability, the airflow is disrupted, and the aircraft instantly tilts towards the extended node. This explained the sudden lurch to the right that had started it all. But the main question remained, why had the slat moved out? Boeing argued that, from a technical point of view, spontaneous movement is impossible. There were locking valves in the system to prevent such cases. To activate the mechanism, it was necessary to physically move the flap lever. NTSB investigators were slow to draw conclusions. They knew that the aircraft could survive strong vibrations and loads. Perhaps the part had failed under pressure. But the calculations of Boeing engineers left no doubt. The design must withstand even double the load from a cruise flight. The decoding of the flight recorders has added even more questions. The parametric recorder showed that the parameters were stable a minute before the loss of control. No sudden movements of the steering wheel, no deflections of the flaps or elevator. The automatic pilot was operating normally. And then the data breaks. The speech recorder, CVR, saved only the last phrases of the crew. Short commands, toggle switches, vibration sound, and shouts of, "Hold it! Gear down! Come on!" No extraneous conversations, not a single hint of experimentation with control systems. The investigators sat in silence for hours, listening to these recordings over and over again, trying to catch the slightest sound that could explain the incident. But there were no answers. At this stage, the investigation was divided into two directions. Boeing insisted that a technical malfunction had been ruled out, so there was still the human factor. It is possible that the crew, violating the instructions, switched the flap system to the so-called alternate flap mode, a mode that allowed circumventing restrictions and manually changing the wing configuration. According to unofficial reports, some pilots actually used this trick, extending the flaps by 2 degrees during cruising flight to reduce drag and save fuel. However, this is officially prohibited. When the NTSB engineers tried to repeat the situation on the simulator, they got an unexpected result. Even when using this mode, the slats do not extend. They remain locked, as they should be. So, the Boeing version didn't add up either. Each new test, each experiment only confused the investigation. Gibson and his crew claimed that they had not touched the flap system and had not performed any manipulation of the controls. Boeing that without this, the slat could not move out. Dead end. A short but important note appeared in the NTSB engineering reports. Some aircraft have previously reported complaints of vibration in the right slat area at high speeds. This meant that the possibility of a hidden defect was not excluded. But to prove it, new challenges, time, and money were needed. In the meantime, Boeing wanted to close the issue as quickly as possible. Every day of the investigation was a blow to his reputation. The media has already written, "Boeing is under suspicion. Could the slats not withstand the load?" And in response, the company issued dry press releases. The aircraft is in good condition. The crew acted incorrectly. But the facts remained contradictory. The technical data said one thing, the crew's experience said another. And somewhere between these two truths, there was a truth that could not be extracted even from the most accurate instruments. The silence of the black boxes is not just a metaphor. Sometimes aviation is faced with a situation where technology tells the truth, but this truth does not coincide with human logic. TWA Flight 841 was just such a case. The plane experienced an overload close to the limit. His body held up, but the answer to the question of why he lost control at all remained beyond the data horizon. The investigation continued. NTSB investigators delved deeper into diagrams, graphs, tests, and interviews, trying to find the moment when the sky over Michigan turned into a spiral. But the longer they searched, the more they realized that the black boxes knew everything except the main thing. By the middle of 1980, the investigation had reached its final stage. Behind the investigators' backs are hundreds of pages of reports, dozens of flight tests, and transcripts that seem to have been listened to thousands of times. And yet the main question remained the same. Why did the right slat extend at an altitude of 35,000 feet? When the Boeing engineers handed over their findings to the NTSB, it became clear that the investigation needed a culprit. The company insisted that the wing design was completely reliable, and the slats could not be extended without a command from the control panel. It's physically impossible. On the tables of the investigators were drawings, diagrams, and test reports. Every valve, every hose and toggle switch was examined under a microscope. And the more they looked at the technique, the more clearly they felt that if it wasn't a technique, then it was a person. The NTSB report has a new version, bold and contradictory. According to her, the crew of flight TWA 841 activated an alternative flap control mode by disabling the slat protection. What for? To improve aerodynamics and save fuel. So the theory of pilot's trick was born. It was based on rumors that had been circulating in the professional community for a long time. They say that some Boeing 727 commanders knew the trick. If you slightly change the configuration of the flaps, just a couple of degrees, the plane flies a little faster with the same fuel consumption. In the era of the late 70s, when the aviation industry was suffering from the oil crisis, any economy was considered a virtue. The less kerosene, the better the reporting. The NTSB suggested that the crew of Flight 841 could have tried this trick, but accidentally turned on the system in the wrong order, causing the slats to unlock. One of them moved out, and the plane immediately lost its symmetry. Hence the instantaneous roll. The version looked convincing on paper. Boeing supported her. This is a human error, not a technical failure. The problem was that none of the crew members confirmed this. Captain Harvey Gibson repeated the same thing during interrogations. I did not perform any actions with the flaps. The autopilot was on. Everything happened suddenly. He spoke calmly, confidently, like a man who knows every procedure. And he had 15,000 flight hours, 2,500 of them on a Boeing 727. To make a mistake in such a simple procedure? Impossible. Co-pilot Jess Kennedy confirmed every word of the commander. We didn't turn on alternate mode. No one touched the levers. We just sat and controlled the parameters. But the investigators did not want to accept an explanation that did not fit into the mechanics. They were running simulations. The screens show the same scenario. A Boeing 727 at an altitude of 35,000 feet, a stable course. Then one slat is deliberately extended. The result is an instant roll to the right, spin and spin. Everything matched. These images formed the basis of the report. The NTSB noted, the cause of the incident was an unauthorized reconfiguration of the flaps by the crew, which led to an asymmetric extension of the slat number 7. In official terminology, it sounded dry. But for the pilots, it meant one thing, an accusation. Gibson, the man who saved the plane and 89 lives, was now considered the culprit of the incident itself. Disputes began in the professional environment. Some supported the NTSB. Yes, there are pilots who like to experiment. Others saw this as an attempt by Boeing to absolve itself of responsibility. After all, admitting a design defect would mean reviewing the safety of the entire 727 line, hundreds of aircraft worldwide. Meanwhile, a leak appeared in the press. The Los Angeles Times wrote an article with the headline, TWA 841 crew may have violated instructions trying to save fuel. It was a blow to Gibson. He was nicknamed the one who turned the flaps. Even though there was no evidence, Boeing and NTSB investigators continued the tests. They installed modified sensors on a similar aircraft to test the possibility of spontaneous extension of the slats. The result was stunning. In laboratory conditions, the defect could indeed be reproduced. With a certain vibration and pressure, the valve in the hydraulic line could move by fractions of a millimeter and unlock the slat. But this fact was not included in the final report. Only one version was publicly left: the crew's mistake. The wording of the NTSB report dated June 9, 1981 sounded cold. The most likely reason is an unauthorized change in the position of the flaps by the crew, which led to wing asymmetry and loss of control. So, 2 years after the incident, Gibson officially became guilty. Without a trial, without a chance of acquittal. He was trying to fight. He wrote letters to the NTSB, demanded a review, and sent requests to Boeing. There was silence in response. One day, speaking at a pilots' conference, he said, "I didn't do anything that could lead to this, and I would do the same thing if it happened again. But I won't let my name stand next to the word mistake." For him, it wasn't just a reputation. That was life. The pilot, who had survived the uncontrollable fall, now had to prove that he was not guilty of his own rescue. Meanwhile, the NTSB report has become an official document. It has been distributed to all airlines, training centers, and universities. The human factor section now featured an example: the crew's error in controlling the flaps at cruising altitude. TWA Flight 841. For Boeing, it was a convenient end to the story. For Gibson, it's a personal disaster. Since then, the phrase has appeared in the professional environment. God forbid you get into the NTSB report, even if you did everything right. But for those who listened to the cockpit recordings, who saw the damage to the plane with their own eyes, the version of the pilot experiment remained too simple, too pure to be true. After all, if the pilots were really experimenting, why wasn't there a word about it in the voice recorder? Why didn't any of the commands match the typical actions when changing the wing configuration? And most importantly, why would a system designed to be reliable suddenly lose its balance? The NTSB did not have an answer to these questions. But the report was signed. The truth is closed. After the publication of the NTSB report, Captain Harvey Gibson's life was divided into 2 periods: before and after. Before that, he was a respected Trans World Airlines commander, instructor, and sky veteran with an ideal reputation. After that, the person who was identified by the official commission, calling him the cause of the accident. In aviation, reputation is not just a word. It's a currency. It determines who you are in the cockpit. Her colleagues trust her, and young pilots rely on her. Losing your name in this environment is equivalent to losing your license, even if you still technically have one. Gibson tried to live as before. He continued to fly, performed flights, followed the regulations, and spoke to passengers through a microphone in his usual confident tone. But every time he heard the call sign W841, his gaze involuntarily darkened. People who didn't know the details looked at him with respect, like a pilot who had miraculously saved a plane. But the colleagues knew. According to the documents, he is the one who created this crisis himself. He couldn't accept it. In 1980, Gibson sued Boeing and the NTSB. His requirement is simple: to review the report, reinvestigate, and admit that the accident was not the fault of the crew. Court documents take up hundreds of pages. Gibson prepared them personally, line by line, rereading the technical reports, hydraulic diagrams, and flap control instructions. He found inconsistencies, demanded explanations, and wrote letters to Boeing's engineering departments. Some of the responses came months later, polite, neutral, but meaningless. "We respect your contribution to aviation, Captain Gibson, but the Commission sees no reason to reconsider the conclusions." These phrases were repeated from letter to letter. He wrote to Congress, contacted journalists, and participated in radio broadcasts, each time repeating the same phrase that became his personal manifesto. "I didn't touch the controls. Never. But the world has already chosen a convenient culprit." For Boeing, admitting even the slightest design error would mean recalling dozens of aircraft, inspections, and losses. For the NTSB, it undermines the authority of the Commission. No one wanted to review the finale. In 1981, when the official investigation was finally closed, Gibson collected copies of all the documents and carefully put them in 2 boxes. On one he wrote in black marker, "The truth about Flight 841. He kept these boxes at home in the attic next to albums of photos from flights. Sometimes he would go up there, open a folder, and just look at the wing diagrams, as if trying to find the point where everything went wrong with his eyes. He stopped giving interviews. He flew less and less often until he retired from aviation. Over the years, his name stopped appearing in the news. The new century has brought other disasters, other investigations. But for Gibson himself, the TWA 841 theme never ended. Colleagues who served with him recalled that he often talked about trust. When something goes wrong in the cockpit, you have to trust the car. And she has to trust you. If one side fails, everything collapses. These words sounded bitter because in his case, the most important thing had collapsed, the trust between a person and the system. He survived the rotation at an altitude of 10 kilometers, overloads from which the metal bent. But what started later turned out to be harder. Being accused without evidence is like flying with the engines off, knowing that no one believes you're trying to hold the plane. Gibson continued to write letters even into the 90s. He was trying to attract the attention of independent experts, former Boeing engineers, and NTSB veterans. Several of them admitted, yes, the Commission's version could be wrong. Yes, theoretically, the slat could extend itself with a certain vibration. But no one has officially confirmed this. The paper accepted no doubts. In the 2010s, his name resurfaced on the pilot forums. A new generation of engineers discussed the old investigation. But maybe Gibson was right? But he didn't hear it anymore. Harvey Gibson passed away in 2015. Quietly, without interviews, without loud speeches. Co-pilot Jess Kennedy followed him 2 years later. None of them ever heard the official words of justification. After his death, his son handed over to the Aviation Museum the very box with the inscription "The Truth About Flight 841. Inside were documents, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and one sheet with a short phrase written in pencil. Truth does not need applause. You just need to hear it. And maybe this is the real price of reputation, when even after proving the impossible, you have to live with someone else's conclusion. Today, decades later, the story of TWA Flight 841 is still controversial. For some, this is an example of human error, for others, systemic silence. But for all the pilots who have heard Gibson's name, this is above all a reminder. Even if you save everyone on board, it does not mean that the system will save you. A few weeks after the incident, the damaged Boeing 727 was transported to a repair plant in Kansas City. The engineers examined him like a doctor examining a patient who miraculously survived a major operation. The right wing console is deformed, the skin is rippling, and there are overload marks on the landing gear. But the main structure of the fuselage remained intact. That in itself was a phenomenon. The aircraft with the serial number N840TW was decided not to be written off. It was restored, the damaged panels were replaced, The mechanisms of the slats and flaps were completely overhauled, and the hydraulic system was checked. In May 1979, a little over a month after the incident, he took to the sky again. No passengers, only testers on board. The first flight lasted 42 minutes and ended safely. The Boeing 727 TWA Flight 841 has returned to service, now in a cargo configuration. It continued to fly for another quarter of a century, until 2005, when it was finally decommissioned. But the mark that this incident left was much deeper than the cracks on the aluminum. Boeing, despite its public position of pilot's fault, has quietly revised internal standards for node inspection. Immediately after the investigation was completed, engineers began to analyze in detail the design of the slat drive mechanism. Additional locks and sensors have been added to eliminate even the theoretical possibility of spontaneous movement. Inside the company, it was called Lesson 841. New recommendations have appeared in the production bulletins sent to the airline, checking the condition of the slats before each flight, additional pressure monitoring in the hydraulic system, and strict restrictions on any manipulation of the flaps in cruise flight mode. For the NTSB, this investigation has become a painful reminder of the limits of human confidence. For the first time, the Commission was openly confronted with a situation where no single data set fully explains everything. NTSB internal reports later acknowledged, some aspects of the incident remain unclear. This is a rare formulation for a bureaucratic structure where everything is usually expressed in numbers and percentages of probability. Airlines have also drawn conclusions. After the 841st flight, a separate module was added to the TWA and other carrier pilot training program for dealing with non-standard situations at cruising altitude, those that were previously considered impossible. Now the crews learn to act not only according to the checklist, but also intuitively if the logic of the system stops working. This case was also a turning point in another sense. For the first time, he raised the issue of trust between pilots and manufacturers. Before that, it was believed that in aviation, the truth is the same, the one that is written in the instructions. After TWA 841, it became clear that even a certified system can behave unpredictably. And the pilot who finds himself in the middle of the action is not always to blame if the car did not act as it should. Boeing has learned its lessons. But, as is often the case, he did it quietly without press releases. In 1982, improved locking valves in the flap system began to be installed on all new 727 models. These details were not disclosed, but the engineers knew that they appeared after the incident over Michigan. In 1983, the FAA revised the certification standards. Now, when designing aircraft, it was necessary to take into account not only theoretical failure scenarios, but also combined ones when mechanics and the human factor intersect. This is how the concept of multifactorial security appeared, a concept in which no element of the system can lead to disaster on its own. The psychological side has also changed. The TWA 841 incident made the pilots reflect on the fragility of trust. After all, if an experienced commander can be accused without evidence, it means that at a critical moment everyone is left alone with the car, and with their own decision. As the years passed, the world of aviation changed. Digital systems, new recorders with extended memory, and detailed training programs have appeared in the cabins. But the memory of that night on April 4, 1979 remained. It was discussed at conferences, analyzed in training centers, and included in cases for young pilots. In the lectures, the engineers said, "We no longer allow asymmetric configurations without sensor confirmation," and the pilots added, "And we no longer blame each other until we know the whole truth." The TWA 841 incident was a reminder that aviation is not only about technology, but also about moral responsibility. Every element of the system, whether it's a valve, a report, or a human word, can decide people's fate. Today, that same plane has long been dismantled. Its parts may be in warehouses or melted down into new metal. But the flight itself has remained in history. He changed how engineers check the nodes, how pilots behave in emergency situations, and how the commission chooses the words in the final reports. From one rotation over Michigan, an entire era of new standards was born. And if in 1979 the question sounded like this, human error or machine failure, now aviation answers in a different way. It's always an interaction between them, and the lesson is that neither side should be left unchecked. When the glide lights come on over Detroit again in the evening, and the silvery hulls of the planes come in for landing, there is a continuation of that story in this light. Because every modern flight, every automatic signal, every black box that writes data in case of the impossible, all this exists thanks to those who once stood in the spiral and did not let it end. Night. It's quiet over Michigan again. The same sky, the same wind direction, only this time without the floodlights, without the roaring engines. Somewhere up there, modern airliners are passing. More powerful, smarter, protected by thousands of sensors and automatic systems. Their pilots, sitting behind the glass of the cockpit, do not even suspect that below them is the very sky where the Boeing 727 once spun in a mad spiral, fighting for every second. From a height of 13 kilometers, everything looks calm. The black expanse of night, the lights of cities reflected in it, and the endless horizon line, where the light of the stars almost merges with human lanterns. But for those who know the history of TWA Flight 841, this silence sounds different. It contains an echo of the cry that once sounded in the cockpit, "Gear down!" And now, where there used to be chaos, there is only the steady breathing of the wind. This story is not about falling. It's about trust. About how in 1 minute a person can lose control of a car that he has trusted all his life. And how he was still able to bring her back under his rule without having a single chance. 89 people returned home. No one died, but the answers remained there between the layers of the atmosphere, where engineering formulas meet human intuition, where numbers don't always explain everything, and experience and self-belief are the only things that keep you from disaster. Every detail of this flight is like a lesson, like a warning written not in ink, but in milliseconds of human reaction. One bolt, one steering wheel movement, one decision in the cockpit can determine what happens next. Life, fall, or rescue. TWA 841 became a symbol of the paradox. The crew who saved the plane was blamed for its loss. And perhaps there is something deeply human in this, the desire to find someone to blame when the nature of technology does not fit into logic. But the sky doesn't know the reports. It is silent. It simply stores everything that has ever happened within its limits. Lights, shouts, commands, silence. Where the Boeing 727 entered the spiral in 1979, other routes are now taking place, digital, accurate, and safe. And yet, if you listen closely, it seems as if the air remembers that vibration. The moment when the metal body resisted gravity, and the 3 people in the cockpit struggled with forces that could not be measured with instruments. Somewhere above Saginaw, an invisible trail still hovers, a thin line that has disappeared into the atmosphere. This is not a trail of disaster, but a trail of survival. A symbol that a person is able to regain control even when physics itself is against him. The Boeing 727 is no more. But his story lives on in the instructions, in the pilot training courses, in the quiet conversations at the simulators, when the instructor tells the young cadet, "If ever it seems to you that everything is lost, remember TWA 841. As long as you're alive and in control, there's a chance. All that's left after that night is a memory recorded in reports, documents, in charred pieces of metal, and in one voice that stood its ground to the end. I didn't touch the controls. Never. The skies over Michigan are calm again, and only the wind, touching the tops of the clouds, seems to repeat the voiceover phrase that ended every summary, every report, every lecture after 1979. There are no small things in aviation. Every detail is a matter of life.